It is the third week of October 1941, and the city of Kharkov is dying by inches. Frost has already begun to silver the cobblestones before dawn, and somewhere beyond the eastern suburbs, the low thunder of artillery rolls without pause, closer each night than the one before. Inside the vast turbine hall of the Kharkov tractor plant, the usual roar of machinery has fallen away to something stranger. The scrape of crowbars against bolted steel, the clang of dismantled lathes being lowered onto flatbed wagons, the shouted instructions of foremen working by torchlight because the windows have been blacked out against air raids. Women in headscarves and padded jackets guide hoists that were never designed to lift anything so heavy, while old men who fought in the last war direct the packing of crates marked only with chalk numbers, a code that means nothing to the Germans should the crates fall into their hands. Outside, a queue of freight wagons stretches for over a kilometer along the sidings, waiting to be loaded and sent east into the darkness, towards the Urals, towards Siberia, towards a destination most of the workers boarding those trains have never seen and cannot picture. Few of them yet understand that what is happening around them, in this one factory and in hundreds of others like it across the Western Soviet Union, is not merely a retreat. It is the beginning of one of the most extraordinary feats of industrial mobilization in human history, an effort that will ultimately help decide whether Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht is broken or triumphant. And at the center of the vast, chaotic apparatus making it happen stands a quiet, precise, almost anonymous Soviet official named Alexei Kosygin, a man whose name will barely register in most Western accounts of the war, yet whose organizational grip on this evacuation will help keep the Soviet Union in the fight when its defeat seemed, to many observers in Berlin, London, and Washington alike, all but assured. For more incredible true stories from World War II, carefully researched and brought to life, subscribe to the channel and never miss a new documentary. To understand why this desperate scramble of machinery and manpower had become necessary, it helps to look at the catastrophe that had unfolded across barely 4 months. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, over 3 million German and Axis troops crossed the Soviet frontier along a front stretching nearly 2,900 kilometers, supported by more than 3,000 tanks and upwards of 2,700 aircraft. The Red Army, still reeling from Stalin's purges of its officer corps in the late 1930s, was caught in a state of only partial readiness. Within weeks, German panzer spearheads had encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies at Minsk and Smolensk, taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners. By early autumn, German forces stood before Leningrad in the north, threatened Moscow in the center, and drove deep into Ukraine in the south, capturing Kyiv in mid-September in an encirclement that yielded, according to German figures, over 600,000 Soviet prisoners, though historians continue to debate the precise total. The territory falling under German occupation by the end of 1941 was not merely land. It represented, according to Soviet economic planners, close to 2/5 of the country's entire population, a similarly vast share of its grain-producing farmland, and, most critically for the war effort, a staggering proportion of its heavy industry. Coal from the Donbass, steel from Ukraine, and armaments plants scattered across Belarus and Western Russia all lay directly in the path of the advancing Wehrmacht or within artillery range of the front. If this industrial base could not be moved, the Soviet Union would simply run out of the tanks, guns, shells, and aircraft it needed to survive, no matter how many soldiers it could still put into uniform. Soviet planners in Moscow calculated, with mounting alarm, that the territories already under threat by late summer 1941 accounted for a substantial share of national pig iron and steel output, along with a considerable proportion of the country's aircraft engine plants concentrated dangerously close to the front. Existing equipment in Red Army hands was also proving tragically inadequate to the task at hand. Many frontline tank units still relied on obsolete light tanks, whose armor could be pierced by standard German anti-tank guns at ordinary combat ranges, while Soviet aircraft, though numerous on paper, were frequently older designs outclassed in speed and firepower by the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. Entire tank and mechanized corps had been destroyed or scattered in the opening weeks of the invasion, their vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel or spare parts rather than lost in battle, a fact that underscored how little margin existed between functioning industry and battlefield collapse. Existing plans for wartime industrial dispersal, drafted cautiously in the 1930s, had assumed weeks or months of warning before any invasion, time to plan rail routes, prepare receiving sites, and move equipment in an orderly sequence. Barbarossa gave the Soviet state no such luxury. Entire regions had to be stripped of their factories in a matter of days, under bombardment, with railways already congested by refugees and retreating troops, and with winter closing in on lines running thousands of kilometers into terrain that, in many cases, possessed no factory buildings at all, waiting to receive the machinery. The scale of the problem appeared, to many senior officials examining it in July 1941, to be close to impossible. For more incredible true stories from World War II, carefully researched and brought to life, subscribe to the channel and never miss a new documentary. The response came through the newly formed Council for Evacuation, established within days of the invasion and placed under the ultimate authority of Stalin's State Defense Committee. But the practical machinery of moving an industrial economy fell substantially to a small group of exceptionally capable administrators, among whom Alexei Kosygin, then in his late 30s and already serving as deputy chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, proved indispensable. Kosygin had risen through Leningrad's textile and light industry administration during the 1930s, gaining a reputation not for ideological flourish, but for an almost obsessive attention to logistical detail, the kind of official who could recite freight wagon capacities and rail gauge specifications from memory. This unglamorous expertise now became irreplaceable. Kosygin was dispatched repeatedly to the most threatened cities, including a perilous mission into besieged Leningrad itself in the winter of 1941 to help organize the evacuation of both industry and civilians across the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga, a route that would become known as the Road of Life. The evacuation apparatus he helped direct had to solve problems that had no precedent in modern industrial history. Entire factories, sometimes employing thousands of workers, were disassembled machine by machine, with technicians numbering every component so that furnaces, presses, and precision lathes could be reassembled correctly at unfamiliar sites thousands of kilometers away, often in open fields, under canvas, before permanent buildings had even been constructed around them. According to Soviet railway records, over 1.5 million wagon loads of machinery, raw materials, and personnel were transported eastward during the second half of 1941 alone, a movement historians have since compared in scale and urgency to a nation attempting to relocate itself while simultaneously fighting for its existence. Priority was given first to armaments plants, aircraft factories, and tank production facilities, since these represented the difference between a functioning army and a defeated one. The Kharkov tractor plant, glimpsed in the opening moments of this story, was one of the most consequential of all, for it was here, and at its new home in Chelyabinsk in the Urals, that production of the T-34 medium tank, already proving itself the most effective armored vehicle on the Eastern Front, would be dramatically expanded. Chelyabinsk itself, receiving equipment and workers from Kharkov alongside components from the Kirov works evacuated from besieged Leningrad, grew so rapidly into a combined production complex that workers and later historians alike came to know it by a nickname of grim admiration. Tankograd, the tank city, a place that had barely existed as an industrial center before the war, and would, within 18 months, be producing thousands of armored vehicles a year. The technical challenge facing Kosygin's evacuation network went far beyond simply loading crates onto trains. Each relocated factory required not only its machine tools, but the specialized workforce trained to operate them, skilled labor that could not simply be replaced by conscripting untrained peasants from the surrounding countryside. Entire communities of engineers, foremen, and their families were moved together, housed initially in barracks, tents, and in some documented cases, simply dug into the earth in half-buried shelters through the brutal Ural winter of 1941 to 1942, while the factories they had traveled with were reassembled around them, often before roofs had been completed overhead. Reconstruction timelines that would ordinarily have been measured in years were compressed, according to Soviet industrial records, into weeks. At one relocated aviation plant, historians note that machinery began producing components within roughly 2 weeks of arrival at its new site, workers operating amid falling snow because the surrounding walls had not yet been finished. The comparison ordinary viewers can grasp most easily is this. It was as though an entire modern car factory, along with every worker who ran it, was picked up complete, transported across a continent in the depths of winter, and made to resume full production before its new building had a roof. Power stations had to be relocated or built anew to supply electricity to these reborn industrial zones. Rail spurs had to be laid from main lines to reach sites that, in some cases, had been empty step only months before. Coordinating all of this simultaneously across dozens of cities and hundreds of factories, while the Wehrmacht continued its advance and while Moscow itself came under direct threat in the final weeks of 1941, required an administrative discipline that Kosygin, moving constantly between sites, chairing committees late into the night, and cutting through competing local demands with blunt practical rulings, provided in extraordinary measure. Soviet accounts describe him personally overruling regional officials who wished to prioritize their own facilities, insisting instead on sequencing that matched the Red Army's most urgent frontline needs, whether that meant tank engines, artillery shells, or aircraft engines. The sheer physical scale of individual machine tools being moved should not be underestimated. Heavy forging presses used to stamp tank hull plates could weigh many tons apiece, requiring reinforced flatbed wagons and improvised cranes to load and unload safely, and a single such press, once installed and calibrated, might take specialist fitters weeks to align correctly under normal peacetime conditions. Under the pressures of late 1941, that same alignment work was compressed into a matter of days, carried out by exhausted technicians working in temperatures that Soviet meteorological records for the Urals region that winter placed consistently below -20 degrees Celsius, sometimes with bare tools that stuck to ungloved skin. Furnaces used for casting armor plate had to be relit and brought back up to precise operating temperatures without the benefit of the refractory brick linings that would normally be given time to cure properly, a shortcut that risked cracked linings and ruined castings, but which necessity demanded regardless. Electrical supply, too, presented a constant threat to the whole enterprise, since a single relocated power station serving several reborn factories left the entire cluster vulnerable to any interruption, and Soviet engineers were forced to improvise redundant generating capacity from equipment never designed for the purpose. It was, in the words later used by Soviet industrial historians, an act of engineering improvisation on a scale without precedent, undertaken not in laboratories or design bureau, but in open fields, under canvas, in the depths of a Russian winter. The results of this effort became visible on the battlefield with striking speed. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. By the time German forces stood at the gates of Moscow in early December 1941, exhausted, frozen, and dangerously extended at the end of supply lines stretching back hundreds of kilometers, the Soviet Union was already beginning to receive tanks, artillery, and aircraft from factories that had not existed in their new locations 6 months earlier. Soviet counteroffensives launched before Moscow that December were supported, in part, by weapons flowing from these relocated plants, an achievement that startled German intelligence assessments, which had confidently predicted Soviet industrial collapse. Exact figures for total wartime tank production vary between sources, but Soviet industrial records indicate that T-34 output alone rose from a few hundred vehicles in 1940 to figures in the tens of thousands annually by 1943, a scale of production that German industry, despite superior individual engineering in many respects, was never able to match. It is worth setting this achievement against equivalent efforts among the other major combatants, since the comparison illuminates just how unusual the Soviet case truly was. Nazi Germany, under Albert Speer's later reorganization of the Armaments Ministry from 1942 onwards, achieved genuinely impressive increases in war production through rationalization and concentration of existing factories. But German industry was never forced to relocate itself wholesale across a continent while under direct military threat, since the core of German heavy industry in the Ruhr remained, for most of the war, beyond the reach of ground invasion. The United States, mobilizing what President Roosevelt termed the arsenal of democracy, under the guidance of businessman William Knudsen and the War Production Board, achieved staggering output, American shipyards alone launching Liberty ships at a rate that startled Allied observers, yet this mobilization occurred on secure home soil, entirely free from bombardment or invasion. Britain's own wartime industrial effort, reorganized under figures such as Ernest Bevin at the Ministry of Labor, faced serious disruption from the Blitz, but never confronted the total loss and forced relocation of its major industrial regions. The Soviet evacuation of 1941 stands apart precisely because it combined the scale of total industrial mobilization with the added, almost unimaginable burden of moving that entire industrial base under fire across vast distances in the depths of a Russian winter, while simultaneously continuing to fight the very army that had made the move necessary. Historians continue to debate exactly how much credit belongs to any single individual within so vast a bureaucratic effort, and Kosygin himself was one figure among many, including Nikolai Shvernik, who formally chaired the Evacuation Council, and numerous regional officials and factory directors whose names rarely survive in the historical record. Yet, Soviet accounts and later biographical studies consistently identify Kosygin's relentless, detail-driven management as one of the decisive administrative forces holding the entire operation together during its most chaotic and dangerous months. The wider historical impact of this mobilization extended long beyond the winter of 1941. The industrial base rebuilt east of the Urals became the enduring foundation of Soviet military production for the remainder of the war, supplying the tanks, guns, and aircraft that would eventually grind the Wehrmacht down at Stalingrad, at Kursk, and across the long, brutal advance to Berlin. Some historians argue that without this evacuation, Soviet resistance might have collapsed under the sheer material weight of the German assault, regardless of the courage or sacrifice of Soviet soldiers at the front, though exact counterfactuals of this kind remain, inevitably, matters of historical judgment rather than certainty. The experience also shaped Soviet economic thinking for decades afterwards, reinforcing a deep institutional commitment to industrial capacity dispersed away from vulnerable border regions, a lesson that would echo through Cold War planning for decades to come. Kosygin himself would go on to become one of the most significant Soviet leaders of the post-war era, serving as Premier of the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1980. And his wartime reputation for competent, unglamorous administrative mastery followed him throughout that later career. Today, remnants of the story survive in museum collections across Russia, including preserved T-34 tanks bearing the markings of Chelyabinsk's wartime Tankograd production lines, and in archival photographs held in Russian state collections, showing factory machinery being reassembled in open fields beneath the same bitter skies described at the outset of this story. Local museums in the Urals region, including displays in Chelyabinsk itself, continue to preserve tools, photographs, and personal testimonies from workers who made that journey east, ensuring that an achievement largely absent from popular Western memory of the Second World War retains a place in Russian historical consciousness, even as historians continue to debate how evenly credit for its success should be distributed among the many officials, engineers, and ordinary laborers who carried it out. Return, for a moment, to that dismantled turbine hall in Kharkov in October 1941. The crowbars, the torchlight, the queue of wagons stretching into darkness. What those exhausted workers were witnessing, without any way of knowing it, was not simply the abandonment of their city. It was the deliberate, desperate, meticulously organized transplantation of an entire nation's capacity to make war, carried out under bombardment, in the depths of an approaching winter, against odds that senior officials on every side, Soviet, German, and Allied alike, might reasonably have judged insurmountable. The factories that left Kharkov on those creaking wagons would rise again in the frozen steppe around Chelyabinsk, and within months they would be producing the tanks that helped stop the Wehrmacht at the gates of Moscow and later helped break it entirely at Stalingrad and Kursk. Exact numbers of factories relocated during 1941 remain uncertain even among specialist historians, with estimates ranging upwards of 1,500 major enterprises, but the certainty that matters is simpler and more human than any statistic. An industrial civilization was picked up, whole, under fire, and carried across a continent by ordinary people executing an almost impossible plan: one bolted machine and one loaded wagon at a time. Alexei Kosygin did not fire a single shot in this war.